Our pollies are letting us down. Our bureaucrats are letting us down. Our mainstream media are letting us down. Our medical establishment is letting us down. And we are letting ourselves down. Lockdowns just don't add up, and they don't make any sense. They're not scientific, they're not rational, and they're definitely not more moral or ethical. G'day and welcome to episode 57 of The Other Side Australia. Your look at the news and opinion from an Aussie classical liberal centre-right perspective, the way it used to be before every journalist in the country decided to go ridiculously woke and abandoned critical thinking for critical theory. In this episode, an exploration of the science and logic of lockdowns. That's coming up in a moment. But first, this week will forever be remembered in history's pages for the catastrophic scenes emerging after the West's evacuation from Afghanistan. Hundreds of young men clambering up an aero bridge to force their way onto a plane to flee the advancing Taliban. Desperate Afghans clinging to military transport planes until they could no longer hold on, and then plunging to their deaths. Not images I'm going to show you here. We have enough anxiety in our lives already, but images that will haunt some observers forever. Among those Australians most affected will be the men and women of the Australian Defence Force and the other government agencies who worked so hard over the past 2 decades to secure Afghanistan, especially the families of the 42 Australians who gave their lives to this conflict. There's a sense of despair in veteran chat rooms as they contemplate what became of their sacrifice in the so-called graveyard of empires. On the ABC, the Prime Minister reassured them that freedom is always worth fighting for, no matter the outcome.
Our thanks are always to Australians who serve. They don't get to decide the mission, they don't get to decide the place. Those decisions are taken at another level, and they go and serve, and they faithfully serve, and they do it with great courage and great commitment to their country and the values that Australia represents, which is freedom.
Were there deaths in vain, though, when you see already people discussing whether this is now going to leave open Afghanistan becoming a breeding ground for terrorism again?
No Australian who's ever fallen in our uniform has ever died in vain. Ever.
In the United States, President Joe Biden has given his administration the all clear, seemingly having anticipated how things would unfold and putting the appropriate measures in place, he claims.
My national security team and I have been closely monitoring the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including and contingency, including the rapid collapse we're seeing now.
So it seems all that chaos unfolding at Kabul International Airport was all anticipated and things went perfectly to plan. If that's the case, they were holding those cards very close to their chest 5 weeks ago when the very same president, in one of the great wrong calls of history, told the world there was nothing to worry about.
Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable. The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
So, telling the world he planned for all these contingencies, President Biden then went on to blame Trump's deal with the Taliban as the main cause of the messy exit.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office.
But as the Wall Street Journal observed in its editorial, note that Mr. Biden is more critical of his predecessor than he is of the Taliban. The president has spent 7 months ostentatiously overturning one Trump policy after another on both foreign and domestic policy. Yet he now claims Afghanistan policy is the one he could do nothing about. This is a pathetic denial of his own agency, and it's also a false choice. It's as if Winston Churchill, with his troops surrounded at Dunkirk, had declared that Neville Chamberlain got him into this mess, and the British had already fought too many wars on the continent. President Biden also went on to blame the collapse on the Afghan leadership.
And when I spoke by phone to Ghani in July, we had very frank conversations. We talked about how Afghanistan should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed, to clean up the corruption in government so the government could function for the Afghan people. We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They failed to do any of that. I also urged them to engage in diplomacy, to seek a political settlement with the Taliban. This advice was flatly refused.
And President Biden blamed it on the Afghan Defense Forces.
We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
Now, sure, there is blame to go around, but President Biden is retrofitting what sounds like perfectly justified reasons for withdrawing to a catastrophic execution. As Chris Kenny explained on his Sky News program, many of the pictures are too disturbing for most viewers.
Of course, we can never show you the real horrors of these situations. There is footage around where people are going about their business, trying to get to safety in Kabul and other Afghanistan cities, with dead bodies littering the streets around them, having to go around them. The horror is unbelievable. It's 15 years or so since I was in Kabul. It was an amazing, shambolic city back then. It's surrounded by rugged mountain ranges. And even then, of course, it was highly dangerous with Taliban and other terrorists looking to undermine order and attack any Westerners or those cooperating with them. But there was hope. Many Afghans spoke then about the prospect of freedom, education and order in their country. It's all going now. It's all finished in a matter of days.
Now, for Australia, we were only ever a sidekick to the US-led force. They wanted our people, who they see as first-rate, and they wanted our flag alongside theirs. For many who served, their concern is now for the families of Australian service people who died for the cause in Afghanistan, and for the Afghans who put everything on the line to help the coalition forces. Reports indicate more than 1,800 of those have been resettled in Australia already, 430 since April this year, in recognition of the growing urgency ahead of the imminent US withdrawal. But grave concerns are still held for others. We don't know yet whether the Taliban of 2021 is any less brutal or fundamentalist than it was when US and coalition troops kicked it out of government in 2001. But early signs are not promising. As one veteran of the Middle East campaigns told this program, the coming weeks and months could see some of the most ruthless mass reprisals since the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in the 1970s. Afghanistan could return to the Dark Ages. And for the men and women who serve there, thank you for denying the country to terrorists for 20 years and keeping us all safe. You did your duty. You served your country, just as you promised you would. Hold your heads high. Thank you. In the next episode of The Other Side, we'll bring you a backgrounder on Afghanistan, why the war began, what Australia's role was, and we'll speak to Australian-American international relations expert Professor Joe Siracusa for his take. That's this weekend in episode 58 of The Other Side. Well, welcome to our new segment dedicated to the Prime Minister and all of our state premiers. It's called Aussie Government Cruelty of the Week. in which we highlight the most disgusting story we can find each week from the newer, meaner, angrier Australia we live in. And I've got to tell you, it's sadly not hard to find them these days. This is Oliver. He's 7. Little Ollie was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumour last October. Oliver's family says that friends have rallied around and been amazing, as have Ollie's grandparents in Coffs Harbour whenever they've been able to get down to Melbourne. The Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and their dedicated doctors and nurses have saved Ollie's life and given the family hope, albeit the tough way, through radiotherapy and chemotherapy. But the family says that 2 people who wanted so desperately to help during Ollie's struggle have been missing. And that's Oliver's other grandparents on his dad's side. It's not for want of trying. They've been knocked back on a visa to travel from the UK despite having been fully vaccinated since April. Knocked back not once, not twice, but 3 times. Ollie's dad notes that since they lodged their first application, Australia has been visited by many celebrities. So many, it seems, that Hollywood has almost relocated here. The hypocrisy of this saddens and angers Ollie's family, quite understandably, while his grandparents have stared down more than once the possibility of never giving their youngest grandchild a cuddle ever again. Despite the intensive treatment, the family is yet to have an all clear that the cancer is properly in remission. If you'd like to help Ollie's family in their campaign for basic human compassion from our idiot political and bureaucratic leadership in this country, jump on to change.org and type in Cancer Kid Ollie, O-L-I, and you can add your name to yet another petition that shouldn't have to exist. Lockdowns. They've never been a part of a public health pandemic strategy anywhere ever before. And that is because they don't work. Why? Because there's a vast difference in the approaches of epidemiologists and public health specialists. And therefore, there's a vast difference between the goals of each when dealing with a public health crisis. Epidemiologists study disease. Their focus is on how disease is caused, how it spreads. To some degree, it's a single focus, a disease outbreak, for example, and it's a study of the past to try and understand what might come next. On the other hand, public health specialists study the health of the public, and health, as we know, is a broad and holistic field and includes the physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, and social. The strategy of public health is threefold. Number 1, health promotion. Number 2, disease prevention. Number 3, treatments and cures. The idea of locking down a community is to try and prevent a virus spreading and causing more disease. That's step number 2. This is what epidemiologists focus on, the disease or the disease-causing virus. By focusing solely on the slowing of the spread of a virus by preventing the movement of people, it's hoped that it'll reduce the amount of disease caused and potentially reduce the load on the healthcare systems. But this ignores the other 2 very important aspects of public health policy. Unfortunately, the focus is entirely on the virus rather than on the human beings. But we humans are a lot more than just a potential host for a virus. Dr. Tom Cade is a specialist medical practitioner with postgraduate qualifications in public health and biostatistics. He has the benefit of both the statistical modelling and the public health perspective, combined with the real-life medical experience of treating actual patients. Dr. Cade explained to Matt and Emily on our sister show, The People's Project, recently, that the vast majority of epidemiologists don't have medical degrees.
They're very bright. They have most would have a science background and subsequent qualifications with mathematics and health modelling, but aren't doctors who have sat across from someone and discussed with them their health as a broader concept. So their voice is important as part of a health response, but it's not the health response. Health is that they have a very univariate, singular focus on this particular problem and some newfound fame on the television. And it just goes to show of the ones that are quoted a lot.
Yeah.
The one who comes across to me as the most reasonable is Peter Collignon from Canberra, who is a doctor, is an infectious disease specialist. So an infectious disease specialist is different from an epidemiologist. There are some who just seem to wait to produce the most drastic, terrible possible thing so they can come online and or on the television and paint this doomsday picture from the safety of their lounge room and their computer where they have a protected salary.
That's Dr. Tom Cade speaking to the People's Project here on the Discernible platform. Now let's look at the recent history of lockdowns. In late 2019, the SARS-CoV-2 virus escaped the Wuhan Institute. The subsequent respiratory disease, COVID-19, was identified and named. The Chinese Communist Party panicked as it saw the disease as causing a virus race through its city of Wuhan and the hospitals becoming inundated. In an attempt to avoid global embarrassment and prevent the virus spreading to the rest of the population, the CCP reacted in true communist style and locked the city down. They even welded people into their apartments, welding their doors closed. It's lovely. Their reaction was as much politically motivated as it was anything else. Now move forward a month or so, and then you have Italy, a massive outbreak of COVID-19. Epidemiologists haven't had a chance to study the disease. Politicians look to the only place with any experience of COVID-19, Wuhan, and they begin locking down, completely ignoring the standard pandemic public health planning. Over to you, Matt and Emily.
Do you know what this is? You know what this is, don't you?
I do know what that is.
This is the COVID-19 pandemic plan for the Victorian health sector, 10th of March 2020, made by the brilliant Health Minister Jenny Mikakos. Do you know what it says? It plans us for a pandemic. Do you know how many times it mentions lockdown?
I'm going to go with 0.
Yeah. Masks? It does mention masks.
It would mention masks, but I reckon...
Not for the public.
No, I reckon they only mention them for those who are identified as sick, on treatment, or in certain settings.
Only certain settings.
Oh.
Only for medical professionals.
Oh, okay.
This is what we had, and then as soon as it happened, this is in March, and when did it hit us? March, right? This went out the window, and you're telling me, the things you're telling me in your 4-point plan, everything that's the logic coming out from the Great Barrington Declaration sounds very consistent. What the hell happened? Wuhan took over the world.
Yeah.
There's some underlying theories to that one.
I think there's no doubt that the two cities did extreme lockdown and everyone followed suit very, very quickly, very strangely.
2 cities, so Wuhan.
And in northern Italy, whichever the one was in northern Italy.
Okay.
And then everyone threw out their version of this and never looked at it ever again.
So by following the science, in this case computer-based tracking and modelling of a virus's behaviour, lockdowns have been the one-trick pony. They were initially used to flatten the curve of infections to protect the healthcare systems. So, okay, kind of makes sense. But then in Australia, they started to be used to try to effectively eliminate the presence of the virus in the community. The so-called zero COVID strategy that I don't recall anyone actually voting for. From a public health perspective, which remember is a holistic health perspective, it's a disaster. Because by focusing on trying to prevent a singular disease-causing virus from spreading and measuring it with just one metric, the case numbers, the lockdown strategy completely fails to address the other two categories of public health: health promotion and treatment and prevention. Lockdowns alone also don't even effectively prevent the disease or the disease spreading. They just simply buy a bit of time for the other systems and actions that do. The vast majority of the population do recover if they suffer COVID-19. Let's take a look at the stats the way they probably should be reported. At the time of recording, there'd been almost 28 million tests done and almost 28 million negatives. 99.86% of Australians tested. A sample probably skewed to those more likely to test positive anyway, because if you go and get a test, you're probably worried you've got COVID and maybe have some symptoms. 99.86% of those people tested negative. Only 0.14% tested positive. 39,096. This is since February 2020, by the way, so 18 months we're talking about here. Out of those 39,000 positives, 958 have died of or with COVID. The vast majority of them over 80 years old, and in the early stages of the crisis through Dan Andrews' aged care bungle in Victoria. So that's 2.45% of everybody in Australia who's tested positive who actually died with or of the disease. Now, as a percentage of the Australian population, that number is 0.0037%. So your chance of not dying of COVID in Australia, as it stands today, is 99.9963%. Now let's look at some other interesting numbers. Total COVID deaths in the country in the past 18 months outside Victoria State, 138. Total deaths under 70 years old since it all began, 69. And total deaths in 2021, 44. That's total deaths. This means that 1 in 370,000 people aged under 70 have died of or with COVID in Australia, and 1 in 111,000 people under 80 have died with it. So the chance of you not dying of COVID to date, if you're under 70, is 99.9997%. Now, amazingly, when I put this data on Twitter a couple of days ago, I was inundated by hand-wringers saying it was irresponsible to downplay the risk of COVID. As if we couldn't ramp the fear up anymore, right? These are just numbers. Numbers are facts. They're not opinion. They aren't laced with the emotion of TV news producers who'd sell their mother for $1, desperate to get you to watch their dying TV news programs. They aren't laced with the fake concerned looks of politicians and CHOs trying to appear more caring and compassionate than the next person, trying to make it look like they're saving you from COVID, so you'll vote for them. So I'll tell you what's irresponsible, folks. What's irresponsible is scaring the wits out of little kids, driving up the anxiety and depression levels of our teenagers and young adults, like the friend of a friend I heard about this week whose daughter is experiencing suicidal ideation, and confusing and worrying little old ladies like the 88-year-old relative I had to calm down because the TV news had terrified her into worrying sick about her grandchildren in Sydney. I know that TV news journalists, and especially executive producers of news programs who live and die by the ratings, are not the most ethical people in the world. I've worked with plenty of them. But folks, please, find some moral compass deep in your soul and stop. Because the fear you are mindlessly exaggerating is having real effects on the young and the elderly and a lot of us in between. This is not a game. It's not time for a ratings beat up and a bit of good old TV journalism, stirring and fun. I seriously don't know how you sleep at night pumping out sensationalist garbage like this.
Good evening. After 8 weeks, we are in the worst position since the beginning of the pandemic. And today the Premier had little hope to give. There were 478 cases and 8 deaths, with Gladys Berejiklian conceding it could be November before restrictions begin to ease.
In the tally of disturbing days in this wave of COVID in New South Wales, this was not what we wanted to hear.
Our community transmission numbers are disturbingly high.
It is blatant fear-mongering, and it's anything but ethical or moral. But it could get really bad if we open up, couldn't it? Well, I don't know. The US state of Texas has about the same population as Australia and New Zealand combined. Texas is having its third wave now, the Delta wave, recording about 14,000 cases a day, which makes Sydney's terrifying 400-something seem like a sad joke. Texas's 7-day average death rate is around 130 a day. That's about 1% of those testing positive, and a whopping 0.00004% of the population. And Texas has had no lockdowns since late 2020 and relaxed many of its remaining restrictions 5 months ago. The Texas governor, the equivalent of our premiers, is Greg Abbott. Here he is telling CNBC about those latest relaxations back in March.
These changes that we've seen in Texas are not really that transformative. Maybe to people in New York, it seems like this is a big difference. In Texas, we went from 75% to 100% occupancy on the mask requirement. Before now, there actually has not been any enforcement of the mask requirement. They made it a mask suggestion, which we continue to make wearing a mask a suggestion, and we urge all Texans to wear a mask when they are out. However, this important factor, Joe, and that is if you look at the spikes in the spread in Texas as well as elsewhere, the last spike occurred during Christmas and New Year's at a time when people were not transmitting it when they went to restaurants or businesses. The lead area of transmission at the time was in the home setting, where people were not wearing masks in the first place, and no one has ever mandated wearing masks in the home setting.
Now, Texas has a full vaccination rate of 45%. 92% of fatalities have been in people aged over 50, 1/3 over 80. So what if we ended lockdowns once we get vax rates to 45% and we had 100 deaths a day from COVID for a couple of weeks? Well, we probably wouldn't, because we're far more isolated and more spaced apart than Texans. And we don't have a president who's allowing thousands of migrants to spill across the border illegally. So just to put things into perspective even more, here's a list of the major causes of death in Australia in a typical year. Heart diseases, 20,000 plus. Dementia and Alzheimer's, almost 14,000. Stroke and cerebrovascular diseases, almost 10,000. Lung cancer, 9,000 almost. Emphysema and other lung diseases, around 8,000. So by comparison, even if we took Texas's approach, deaths from COVID are unlikely to rank too high on that list. And let's not forget the number of people who die from flu and pneumonia every year in Australia. In the bad flu years of 2017 and 2019, it was well above 4,000, but no mass lockdowns then. On top of all this, we have to add the fact that because our governments are failing to take a holistic public health approach, more people are likely to die of those other causes. A recent US report by the George Mason University concluded that the unintended consequences of lockdown fall generally into 5 categories. Lack of care, including delayed diagnosis and treatment of fatal diseases, isolation, leading to perhaps deaths that wouldn't have otherwise occurred, or at least a lot of misery from loneliness, other types of immediate health loss, psychological harm, and harm to children. And that the consequences in each of those 5 categories are significant. Then we have to add the cost of human misery. Earlier this month, Lifeline Australia recorded the highest volume of calls in the organisation's 58-year history. And all of that is before we even start to consider the non-health impacts of lockdowns, the massive economic effects, which will also kill people. And something we should take a lot more seriously, the erosion of our fundamental freedoms and human rights, including our right to privacy, that's been tossed aside for contact tracing reasons. Add all this up, and it becomes very clear. Our pollies are letting us down, our bureaucrats are letting us down, our mainstream media are letting us down, our medical establishment is letting us down, and we are letting ourselves down. Lockdowns just don't add up, and they don't make any sense. They're not scientific, they're not rational, and they're definitely not more moral or ethical. So those of you who've been buying into the revolting new dobbing and shaming culture, you might want to hang your own heads in shame. Did you get a kick out of putting down the family who had the engagement party this week? How dare they think for themselves? It's not like Australia is a free country anymore where you get to personally assess risk or anything. Anyway, back to the numbers. Why is the fatality rate of COVID-19 generally so low. This is because the innate immune system of most people is able to deal with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. However, one of the worst things you can do during a pandemic is lock people into their homes. Why? Because healthy immune systems require healthy people. Preventing people from working, spending time with family and friends, exercising, playing sport, eating well, practicing their faith, being engaged with their communities, seeking healthcare for other issues, all those things cause the immune system and population's general health and well-being to be very compromised. And this is why health promotion is such an important part of the public health mix. Lockdowns damage the public's health. They might reduce the spread of a virus for a little while, but the cost is just way too big to make it actually worth it. And when it comes to things that the government should be caring about, like whether children can go out and play in the sunshine in a playground, or the rate of suicide and the ridiculous number of suicides that seem to be happening among our young people in this country at the moment, this is what Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer of the state of Victoria, and Premier Dan Andrews had to say when asked about the rising suicide cases at a press conference this week.
In terms of what's at stake, we've had 8 females under the age of 18 die by suicide according to the latest Coronials data between January and July this year. That's the highest number in 5 years. 51% increase when it comes to teenage self-harm at emergency departments. I mean, how are you preparing, or how do your rules take that into account, given this mental health emergency that we've heard so much about?
These are absolutely tragic circumstances, but I've been asked this question 100 times. It's always the same answer, that the alternative is that this goes on for longer and it's harsher, or we suffer hundreds of deaths, literally hundreds of deaths.
Do you commit to, lifting the curfew and easing these new restrictions to give people some respite?
I'm not going to go to decisions
approach.
that I may or may not make 2 weeks from now.
In terms of the reality, though...
Sorry, I've got to go. Thank you.
Well, let me pick up the point about a different approach. Look, Sorry, yep.
What's your message to people who are really upset by the fact that we haven't seen any deaths from COVID in Victoria this year yet, but we have seen the deaths of 8 girls that we've learned of under these restrictions?
Yeah, but hang on a minute, hang on. We've got a coronial report. Every suicide is a terrible tragedy. But let's not be speaking as if we can attribute with absolute certainty what motivated each of those tragic acts.
And that's the 2 people who are making just about every decision about everything about every Victorian's life at the moment. We've gone completely mad. And if you can't see that by now, then I think we have a bit of a problem in this country in terms of our education. It's not just what they are doing, it's also what they are failing to do. It's not just whether we're stopping the virus, it's all the unseen problems that we're causing as a result of our approach. It just doesn't add up. New laws being put forward by the lib-lab, jib-jab major parties, Liberal and Labor, could put up to an estimated 30 minor political parties in danger of being barred from running at the next election, according to a report in the Guardian Australia newspaper this week. The paper says the changes will require all parties to have 1,500 members at least, and then it'll ban them from using words in their names that are already used by existing parties, like Liberal or Labor, as if they're copyrighted words. Campbell Newman, the Liberal Democrats' lead Queensland Senate candidate, told Guardian Australia newspaper it was a black day for the Liberal Party, that they would seek to essentially rig the electoral laws to their own benefit. He said the party was running scared, noting that the Australian Electoral Commission's interpretation of the existing law accepts that words such as Labor, Democrat and Liberal are part of the political lexicon and are not capable of being owned by any particular party. Annie Wright of the New South Wales Christian Democratic Party said the amendments were a means by which to wipe out minor parties. She told The Guardian it's not good for our democracy, for our community engagement in politics either. we'll keep an eye on this story in the weeks ahead. And that is it for episode 57 of The Other Side Australia. Thanks to Alison Hallier for research and writing on the lockdown story in this episode. And thanks to our defence contributor, who I think we'll just call Colonel Sanders, for this episode's Afghanistan story. Don't forget to catch up with us on discernible.io. Discernible.io is the website. Make sure you join the Discernible crew. Please remember to click the subscribe button on all the platforms on which you watch. There'll be another episode in a couple of days. And if you're following us on YouTube, do click that bell so you get notified when we post our new content. Do sign up for the Discernible crew at discernible.io. And if you'd like to be added to our VIP WhatsApp group, what you got to do is send an email to theothersideost@gmail.com. Ask to be added, and we'll send you back a link that will allow you to join. See you again soon for episode 58, where I'll be joined by Professor Joe Siracusa to discuss Afghanistan and the implications for Australia.